Hello, good evening. My name is James Crabtree. I'm the Executive Director of the International Institute for Strategic Studies office in Singapore, where I'm speaking here this evening for our event, What is Cyber Power and Where is it Going? A conversation with our Senior Advisor, Marcus Willett. The IISS has been undertaking a series of research programs looking at issues relating to cyber and cyber power, an issue that's frequently in the news, from the recent solar wind attack to President Joe Biden's remarks last month that cyber campaigns soon enough are going to start what he called a real shooting war. But behind that lurks the question of what exactly we mean by cyber power and why some countries are more powerful in the cyber domain than others. And then behind that, the question of, well, how would you measure that? What methodology might you use to try and understand why one country has a greater quantum of cyber power than another? And it's to tease through some of these issues that we are going to have our conversation with Marcus Willett this evening. So Marcus has been part of the IISS team for a little while now, but has a distinguished career as a public servant. He worked for GCHQ as its first head of cyber, and was instrumental in developing the UK's first national cyber strategy, and was also part of the team that wrote a major IISS dossier, which came out 2 months ago, looking at this question of cyber power, and also preceding it, a paper that we wrote outlining the methodology that the IISS has used to try and tease through the question of, well, how should you judge a country's cyber power? What are the criteria that you look for when trying to make these judgments about which is a top tier cyber nation and which might be a little bit further down the pecking order? So welcome, Marcus. Thank you for agreeing to talk to us this evening. Just to go through the proceedings very quickly, we're going to run for an hour. So it's just after 8 o'clock here in Singapore, 1 o'clock if you're joining us in London, or 8 a.m. in the morning if you're an early bird in the United States. Marcus is going to introduce the topic for about 10 minutes. So I'll turn to him in a minute. Then I'll have some questions to ask him, and then we'll turn it open to Q&A from yourselves in the audience. There are two ways that you can ask questions. The easiest and most obvious is to use the Q&A function. Just write your question in there and include your attribution. So say who you are and where you're from. Try and keep it reasonably brief if you can. The other is to use the chat function if you either prefer that or you want to clarify what you'd asked in the Q&A. And we'll get through as many of the questions as we can in the second half of the webinar. So that's it. That's it from me. Many thanks for joining us. We've got a nice crowd here this evening, so appreciate you taking the time. And with that, Marcus, can I turn over to you? Do you want to have a crack at the question of what is cyber power and where is it going?
Well, thank you, James, for that introduction, and good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone, depending on where you are. I think we'll get most value from this session if it is mainly a conversation. So I'm going to ensure plenty of the time is devoted to questions and discussion, first with James and then involving all of us. So I'm going to make just 4 brief comments points by way of introduction. Firstly, the short history of digital communications, the internet, the web, cyberspace, whichever term we use, has been a very exciting one. It has revolutionized the way we communicate, learn, play, are entertained, shop, bank, develop friendships, and even how we might meet our future partners and spouses. It has been a hotbed of brilliant research and innovation. It underpins the way agriculture, food distribution, financial services, healthcare, transport, water supply, and energy work today. Or put another way, it is fundamental to the critical national infrastructures of states. It is now a pivotal part of the global economy. It's how governments interact with their citizens, and it enables the global spread of ideas. And this was all true before we came to rely on it even more during the current pandemic. If only we all had shares in Zoom, eh? Some have called this new digital empowerment the third industrial revolution. And remarkably, we now already find ourselves in what some are calling a fourth industrial revolution, where digital connectivity, artificial intelligence, and other new technologies combine to enable a growing automation of at least the more mundane aspects of human activity in the smart houses, towns, cities, and countries of the Internet of Things. Secondly, though, this all, of course, has a flip side. States realise they face security risks, by which I mean threats and opportunities, in what has quickly become a new domain of everyday state-on-state competition, meaning that cyberspace has also revolutionised the way states spy, conduct statecraft, exert influence, have strategic effect, which also means states must protect their own networks, by which I mean their critical national infrastructure, their citizens, their society, their economy, their national security, from the various threats that cyberspace enables, including the malign activity of other states. Indeed, some even argue that cyberspace is the domain in which conflicts and wars can be won or lost. And I'm afraid we've also seen a massive and rapid growth in online threats from non-state actors, especially criminals, with financial crime and sexual predation particularly prevalent. Just look at the current plague of criminal extortion across the globe using ransomware and the various revelations about online child sexual exploitation. In short, cyberspace has enabled a new speed, scale, and geographic reach for all sorts of bad and worrying things. Perhaps inevitably, there is a virtual snake in our new virtual paradise. Thirdly, then, states are faced with the dilemma of what to do about the various risks they face. Part of this is about investing heavily in protective measures and building their resilience to cyber attacks. And I'll come back to the term attack shortly. With, for example, a burgeoning specialist cybersecurity industrial sector growing exponentially in many states. But a wide range of political issues have also emerged around the effectiveness of so-called cyber deterrence, as suitable responses to cyber attacks, including the efficacy of retaliating in kind, whether to outlaw the paying of ransoms to criminals, etc., through to whether existing international law can be applied, or whether we need new conventions, and a host of other issues, all of which include debate around the utility of developing and using one's own offensive cyber capabilities. Certain issues recur in these debates. For example, misunderstandings of the term cyber attack. It has always been meant by the specialist community in a technical sense, in that a network or device is attacked by code to achieve an effect. But as the term's usage spread, it has often been conflated with legal definitions of an armed attack or use of force, complicating the consideration of appropriate responses. This can lead to things that are really espionage, the interception of information and data, being labelled acts of war, as happened at times during the discussion in the US of the SolarWinds hack. As another example, the idea that it is terribly hard to attribute a cyber attack seems to persist, despite the fact there seems to be a lot of attributing going on, and I'm very happy to discuss that in conversation. And the term offensive cyber is often poorly understood. For example, it is easy to fall into the trap of thinking that offensive cyber covers just destructive military stuff, whereas the term actually covers the full range of effects delivered by cyber operations, cognitive and physical, from countering criminality, terrorism, and malign state activity, to supporting your own statecraft and to waging war, whether the operations are conducted by civilians, military, or both together. And crucially, it is often forgotten that an offensive cyber operation cannot be conducted from a standing start, that it requires a great deal of intelligence, reconnaissance, pre-positioning, and testing that, for the hardest targets, can take a long time. The clear implication being that, to have an effect during a conflict or war, a lot often needs to be done in peacetime to be ready, wherein lies a considerable risk of miscalculation, obviously. Anyway, today we see President Biden raising the issue of Russian hacking and/or hacking by criminals based in Russia with Putin, as Obama had previously raised such issues with the Chinese leadership. According to some, Biden threatened that the US would sort out the problem if Putin didn't. And intriguingly, he is reported as having tried to put 16 areas of critical national infrastructure off limits. And as James has alluded to, Biden has separately intimated that if the US ends up in a shooting war with a major power, it will be likely a major cyber breach that will be to blame. That's quite a statement. So, in all of this under my third heading, I've been merely scratching the surface of a host of thorny issues. So there are all sorts of things here which I hope we'll be able to get our teeth into during discussion. But before we do, my fourth and final point I just want to highlight two important and connected concepts that are rumbling along in the background to all of this, perhaps foreground, depending on your perspective. One is the idea of state cyber power, what it is and how we can assess it. It stems from an obvious point, given everything I've already said about cyberspace, that the ability to exert power and influence, perhaps even dominate in this new domain could, given everyone's growing dependence upon it, prove decisive for the overall power and geostrategic influence of states. For example, it is no accident that control over the production and export of the hardware that underpins cyberspace, the computers, the phones, the microchips, servers, switches, data centers, fiber optic cables, communications satellites, cellular radio towers and antennae, and even of the software that runs across it all, like Facebook, Twitter, TikTok and WeChat, is at the heart of current superpower tension between the US and China. The ongoing Huawei 5G debate being just a symptom of this bigger issue. It seems that both the US and China have realized that to be a global superpower, you need to be a digital superpower. Anyway, as James has alluded to, we at IISS have developed and used a methodology for assessing such state cyber power. It is pretty comprehensive, is qualitative as well as quantitative. In other words, there is a lot more analysis and judgment than you'll find in index-based approaches. And yeah, that's going to be, I suspect, the main feature of some of the questions that are going to follow. The second concept I want to highlight is the idea of acting responsibly in cyberspace. We see states calling out the reckless, irresponsible behavior of some states in cyberspace while maintaining that they themselves are responsible cyber actors, as the UK did with its recent announcement of its national cyber force. But there are no clear national descriptions, let alone international agreements, about what this really means. It is undoubtedly difficult territory. It requires that states talk about how they operate offensively in cyberspace. But I believe that the conversation is possible while still protecting national secrets, and more importantly, is desperately needed if we are to find a way of confronting some of the many and varied risks we face from irresponsible cyber behavior. Again, it would be great to explore all of this and where it might be headed further in discussion. So at that point, I'll stop and hand back to James and let the conversation begin.
Very good, thank you, Marcus. So part of the purpose of this is to some of the good works that Marcus has contributed to the IISS. So one of them is this gigantic report, which came out, as I mentioned, about 2 months ago, Cyber Capabilities and National Power. But underpinning it was this slightly briefer report. It's not 200 pages long, and I just put the link in the chat function if anyone wants to go and have a quick look at it, a methodology for assessing the cyber power of states. So, I mean, Marcus, this seminar is not going to be into the nitty-gritty of methodological questions, but I think for those who aren't familiar with it, could you just give us the briefest pen portrait of in a sense, what this methodology was? There were 7 criteria that you and our cyber team developed. You know, just give people a little picture of it and why you thought it was so important to have this kind of methodology before you produced the big dossier.
Yes, of course. Well, I think the first point to make is that it's just say a word or two about how we produced it. Yeah, there was lots of great work from the cyber team within IISS, but equally other IISS experts. We also reached out to very expert and specialist communities in the UK and across the globe, workshopped what we were doing, and of course, you know, tested it pretty rigorously in trying to produce the document you've already referred to. So very much a collective effort. And I will say part of the expertise we pulled in, crucially, was people who weren't immersed in cyber the way that some of us are, who could ask the really difficult questions. You know, why have you done it this way? What does that mean? Which was really useful. The methodology itself, well, you know, there are certain aspects to it that I think everybody would have in their methodology, what we might call the core operational components of doing cyber. You know, do you have a good core cyber intelligence capability? Do you have good cybersecurity and resilience? What is your offensive cyber capability? That's 3. We built on that in those, as we worked it through and workshopped it, of course added in, well, what's your strategy and doctrine, what's your governance, command and control. But I think the 2 that I found most interesting were the need to consider the ability to control the physical infrastructure and the software that runs over cyberspace. So we've called that cyber empowerment and dependence. It addresses a particularly interesting question, which is, could I protect myself from all those big risks in cyberspace by switching myself off from the internet? Well, the answer is, well, you therefore don't have access to a lot of information and data, so it's a really important part of the problem. But then how do I manage the fact that I'm dependent on cyberspace for a lot of what I do? I think the other big thing for me was the international dimension, how states play on the cyber global affairs in the global affairs space. That includes, obvious stuff, how they get what they view as important across in international fora like the UN. But it also, I think, says it showed how much alliances and the ability to operate with other nations and to attribute with other nations, how much that plays in assessing cyber power. And we can come back to that if you like. But those, I think I've therefore covered about, I have actually mentioned the 7 components of the methodology.
Very good. Masterfully done, I might say. So before we dive into the analytical issues, let me ask just a little bit about your own background. So insofar as you're able to talk about this, you used to work at GCHQ, the UK Signals Intelligence Agency, and so you worked on cyber there. So in the report, you talk about the fact that most of the important components of cyber power are not directly linked to governments. So we should think of cyber power as a function of a cyber industrial complex and broad sort of cyber enabling capabilities like education. But clearly an important component of this is, agencies within states that come up with cyber policies and actually lead these kind of offensive and defensive operations. So can you just say a little bit about, in a sense, what you took out of your previous professional experience, which then went into the methodology, as it were? So where are you coming from personally?
Yeah, so of course, my background has given me a certain inside track in that I've experienced the operational aspects of cyber power, and I've also been with policymakers as they consider the issues. I think, to be honest, my background has also been a problem in some instances. Because I think whenever I speak about cyber, people assume I'm coming from a certain standpoint. They assume I'm a SIGINTer, and therefore I'm going to view things in a particular way. And I think, to be honest, that realization of these wider dimensions to cyber, which had bubbled away while I was working in government. It's probably taken working in a think tank and with many companies around the world to fully expose me to the sort of way we should holistically think of cyber power. And you mentioned all the various aspects there. And to me, I think this comes across in our report as well. One of the crucial aspects for states is how they draw all those different constituencies together. It's how governments work with the private sector, with academia, with their startup and innovation and academic worlds, reaching right out to their, education and their citizens, what you might call a whole of society or a whole of nation response. That feels like the gold standards that states need to aim for when it comes to cyber, especially cybersecurity and cyber resilience. No state has really sorted that one out, I would say, and you see Jan Easterly in the States, the head of the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency there, talking about that only this week and the need to improve all of the joining up across those different sectors in the United States. And they're probably the best at this. That's all I'll say. Okay, great. Much appreciate that. So we already got some good questions coming in.
to Randy in Virginia on the chat function, when I was asking where you were coming from, I meant institutionally as opposed to the fact that you were in Virginia. So if any of you are asking questions, maybe let us know if you are, where you work, if that's relevant to your question as well, just so I can let Marcus know. But I'm going to ask a few more questions before I turn to the audience. So you mentioned offensive cyber. The IISS has a forthcoming publication on offensive cyber campaigns by the great powers, by the US, Russia, and China. But you said kind of teasingly in your introduction that you felt that this was a rather misunderstood concept. And I wondered if you could say just a little bit more about why that is.
So some of this, I think, is about terminology. I won't go into the history of, what was computer network attack became offensive cyber. Some people would refer to it as cyber operations. And I think I alluded to some of this in my introduction, that, the full scope of what, a country like the UK and the US mean by offensive cyber is sometimes not fully understood. But I think more importantly, there are all sorts of policy issues around how offensive cyber capabilities are used, the extent to which they can have a deterrent effect, the extent that they can be used for retaliation, including against cyber criminality, how they are operated offensively, what targets should be off limits. That can only be properly discussed in a policy way if there is a better understanding of the operations themselves, how they are conducted, and therefore I think it's beholden on states like the US and the UK and others to talk a bit more about their own particular experience in this field. I think there's a way of doing that, as I've said, that can talk about concepts without getting into things that would be very sensitive. But I think that's crucial if we're going to understand things like what behaving responsibly in cyberspace means. So that debate needs to happen. It needs to be fueled by people who have the expertise, both from a policy and operational perspective, to seed it with the right information. So that's essentially what I mean.
Very good. And you use the example of the solar wind attack as a sort of an example. This isn't state offensive cyber, but this is the problems of the categories that people use. You also wrote an interesting article for Survival, which is the IISS journal in its last edition, not the current one, in which you talked about the dangers of the way people are misattributing these attacks. I think if I took it correctly, basically the US overreacting to something which is really better understood as traditional espionage as opposed to a war-provoking act. So can you say a little bit more about that? And in a sense, are you saying that there's a danger that states are, as they build up their cyber power also, as Mr. Biden seems to be doing, getting a bit hot under the collar about this in ways they might come to regret? Well,
of course, we don't know really what Biden said to Putin and how hot under the collar he actually got. I think the point is that people can misunderstand stuff that can look like an attack when it's actually espionage. But I think the point goes back to the perpetrators of these types of operations. And the point here is your espionage operation could be misunderstood if it's not run and signaled in a very careful way as something more serious. And I think the complicating factor, of course, is that an operation that to all intents and purposes can look like an espionage operation and even be intended as an espionage operation can get to places where it could be repurposed pretty quickly to do damage. So I am not in any way underestimating the complications in this field from, to trying to understand what the real intent behind a hack really is. And I think that complicates the sort of judgments that leaders and politicians like Biden have to make. So this area is ripe for misunderstanding and miscalculation, which I think is at the heart of why Biden says said what he did about, the chances of there being some, real world robust consequences from a cyber operation, which could have gone wrong, could have been misinterpreted. That's why I think we need a bit more in the public domain about understanding some of the rules of the road about responsible cyber behaviour.
Let me just ask a couple more before I turn to the good questions we've got coming in from our audience. So you mentioned in your introduction the concept of cyber deterrence. So that's something that's much discussed. We had Lloyd Austin, the US Defense Secretary, here speaking at the IISS in Singapore in our Fullerton lecture, and he talked about the US Pentagon's concept of integrated deterrence, which is the fashion now in which you have conventional forces but integrated with areas and domains like cyber. Do you think cyber deterrence actually works? Is there evidence on this, and how do you feed that into the methodology that you've created?
So I think it's a really interesting question where it's a bit of a cop-out, but the jury is out to a certain extent. The issue is to have a deterrent effect, you sort of have to signal the damage you could do. And clearly with some of the capabilities we're talking about, that is hard. An interesting way of looking at this, though, is to think whether at any point we are being deterred in any respect by Russian and Chinese cyber activity that's happening to us. Are we therefore worrying about the consequences of what we might do in response with our own cyber capabilities because of that understanding of the sorts of cyber capabilities that are aligned against us is a really interesting question. Theories have run around cyber deterrence. I think the original theory was you demonstrate your offensive capability by being really good in terms of denial, in that you can defend your own bit of cyberspace, and not only is that deterrence by denial a good thing in itself, but it's meant to demonstrate your offensive capability. That goes so far. So I think this is another aspect of the debate that needs to happen. People understand what people are trying to achieve by using offensive cyber operations for what they say are deterrent effects. Well, how does that work, and does it work?
So let me just ask one final question, and then we'll open it up. And that's, in a sense, you began to touch on this at the end, but both really in the final chapter of the big report, in which you give the conclusions, you talk a little bit about what states should learn from this approach to thinking about cyber power. And you mentioned in the case of the United States that in a sense it had perhaps become closest to this whole of society approach to cyber power that takes in the capacity of your security agencies, but also the resilience of your commercial sector, your education, all the rest of it. Maybe could you talk a little bit more about two other examples of what you think other countries should take from this? So one is China, which came in the second tier of your qualitative ranking. And in the end of the report, you mentioned what you think China should do to improve its position. But then, what about a country that's much further down the rankings, an emerging market like Indonesia in this part of the world, or a country in Eastern Europe, perhaps nearer where you are, as they're trying to develop their cyber capabilities? How should you try and develop from a lower base? And maybe then we'll open it up for questions. So.
Okay, so China. I think from our study, they might take a direct message about how they might approach cybersecurity, which their own reports show they've got all sorts of weaknesses, as of course of all states, but and they might be able to learn from the way in liberal democracies a private sector cybersecurity industrial base has been incentivized. I think China would probably I think probably understand that what they've been trying to do in terms of developing their digital industrial base is a good thing in terms of cyber power, but perhaps the way they're doing it is going to cause them problems. That either their companies are going to have very obvious connections with the Chinese Communist Party and be used, to surveil their internal population, with therefore there being all sorts of implications for how their companies succeed abroad, or they can think of a different way of how those companies globalize and internationalize. That would be, I think, quite a big, strong, powerful message. In terms of countries elsewhere, I think our study shows that countries are in different parts of the cycle in developing their cyber capabilities. Some might, I can think of countries that have actually some really good cyber digital industrial potential, but need to concentrate on a specific aspect of the 7 dimensions I've mentioned. Typically cybersecurity and resilience is the one that leaps out for a lot of the states in the perhaps in the 3rd tier of our assessment. But it is, I think, very dangerous to say there is one particular thing that all states need to concentrate on to be more powerful in cyberspace, because I think that fails to take account of the particular place they are in the the development of cyber capabilities overall. So that's an easy answer. I mean, if you're wondering about some of the states that have that particular industrial potential, states like Japan and Indonesia and a lot of the Far Eastern countries there, but they need to really concentrate on their own cybersecurity and resilience.
Very good. Well, let's throw it open. As it happens, one of the very first questions from Masato Kimura: why do you think Japanese cyber capability is so low, and how can Japan improve its capabilities? So since you just mentioned Japan, let's do that, then I'll go to another couple of broader ones. So, well,
the first thing is, comparatively low in some respects is how I would phrase it. And I think there's another point to make, which is no state that we looked at, including the US, can consider themselves being, perfect in any of these regards. But Japan has real advantages, and I've alluded to those in terms of the number of digital companies in the top, 50 digital tech companies in global listings. Japan, I think, scores second only to the US. It's got a really strong industrial base. I've alluded to cybersecurity. I'd say almost every state needs to improve its cybersecurity and resilience. Japan also needs to do that. I think Japan clearly needs to think about those two other operational categories, that's core cyber intelligence and offensive cyber, where for historic reasons those might not have been as developed as in some other states. I think Japan has a good solution, which is also another interesting lesson for many of the states that are in the lower tiers in our assessment, which is how you ally and work both bilaterally and multilaterally with other nations who can help you in this space. And as I think of that, I should have remembered that that's my other lesson for China, which I think should be deafening, which is to note, and this is a lesson for Russia as well, is to note when it comes to attribution, at least the amount of the number of states that can join up an array together to send a powerful collective message. Will indicate that a lot of these states, Japan included, have that ability to operate in alliance with other cyber capable states, and what that means perhaps needs to be properly understood. There is no example that I can think of China and Russia having a similar sort of collective response.
So here's an interesting question. So since I'm based and speaking to you from Singapore, we have a question from Peter Chua, who's at the Singapore Ministry of Defense. So thanks for this question, Peter. He says the struggle to rise up the ranks, in quotes, in cyberpower metrics is necessarily a zero-sum game. What do you make of the projection of cyberpower in the future, and what kind of equilibrium do you see when the dust settles? So put another way, is cyberpower going to be highly correlated to state power as it exists in the world outside of cyber? Or is there some other kind of equilibrium that you might get in the relationship between cyberpower and the ranking of nations?
Cool.
Good question. Huh?
Yeah, it is, isn't it? Thank you. I think what I'm contending is that it would be a mistake to try and think of cyber power as something separate from the use of cyberspace to exert national power, if that makes sense. The domain is now so integral to so much of what states are important to states that you can't think of your own national security without thinking of your cyber security. You can't think of your national economy without thinking of the strength of your national economy without thinking of the strength of your digital economy. You can't think of your national resilience without thinking about your digital resilience. These are fundamentally integrated and entwined with how you must approach these issues. And so, I think this is a really important point around the maturity of states' responses to what cyberspace means for them. I can give you a trivial and rather military version, but I will do it. Is one level of maturity the fact that you have in your military cyber exercises? So you sit around as the military and you think, maybe you have ranges, and you think what this, a cyber attack might mean for you, and you think about how you might respond in cyberspace. Well, that's one level of maturity, but a new level of maturity is you integrate cyber into your normal exercises. So when you are doing your big theatre level exercise as a military of whatever state, cyber isn't something separate. It is thoroughly integrated in how you approach that exercise. I think that's one way of illustrating how I think the future needs to look.
Very good. Let me turn to, so we had a question from Miriam Howe from BAE Applied Intelligence, another interesting question about big tech. So Miriam says, I've found that the construct of cyber power is necessarily state-based and geopolitically orientated. It does therefore limit the discussion of interstate tensions and ignores the multinational nature of big tech, which might not be aligned to a national cyber strategy, particularly in democratic market-led countries, by which I think Miriam means, big footloose multinational companies that might want to do business with all comers, not just your own country. So in a sense, does the methodology that you've developed, how does it take into account the power of these big technology companies? I mean, in one sense, you've said that the power of your technological base, the big tech companies, is a big part of what makes a country cyber powerful. But how do you account for these giant tech beasts?
So yes, another really interesting question. They're all really interesting and hard, which is good. I would say a couple of things. Firstly, when we were measuring certain cyber capabilities, so let's take offensive cyber or cyber intelligence capabilities of states, we tried to draw a distinction between companies or non-state entities that were sponsored or directed by states and those that weren't. So we wouldn't have said Google is part of the US's cyber intelligence capability. Nevertheless, we do have that big section around empowerment and dependence, which is about the degree to which companies that might fly your flag, even though they're multinational, can influence how cyberspace develops and how it is used. And that we have considered, and it is vitally important. And I would go further, as I did a bit in my introduction, say that states around the world like China have realized how important that is. They might have learnt that through all sorts of reasons. Part of it might have been they poured all over the 2013 Snowden revelations and found it quite interesting to see what it is alleged, how it is alleged that government and bits of the private sector work together, around certain cyber capabilities. So I think our methodology does take account of those broader implications of a state's digital, technical, industrial base, and does try to measure it. In fact, makes it quite a very important part of how you ascend through the tiers.
Very good. And I don't think, Marcus, you thought you were going to get away without being asked to talk about Russia and Putin and Biden. So we have a question from Yona Bob, who's from the Jerusalem Post. So I'm guessing joining us from Israel. And his question asks, talks a little about the Obama and Biden administrations and their approach to cyber. But the gist of it was that Russia has in various forms been alleged to have attacked the US, even after the Biden-Putin summit, seemingly ignoring Biden's demands. And so this gets back to this question of maybe cyber deterrence or capabilities. So Bob's question, how hard do you think the US would need to hit Russia with a counter cyber attack to get it to back down? Or are you also concerned about a US counterattack leading to out-of-hand cyber escalation? Or is it given, if you are concerned about that, is there some other way of getting Russia to back off, which simply does not involve cyber at all?
Really important point here. If you are attacked, and we can argue about whether the US was attacked in cyberspace during SolarWinds, for example, it doesn't mean you have to respond, or it is a good idea to respond in cyberspace. And of course, what we've seen is plenty of other sorts of action taken by allied states in response to cyber operations. One is that collective calling out and attributing of a cyber attack. That can sound ineffective, and it's very easily denied by the state that has perpetrated the attack. Except, of course, I would contend the state knows it has perpetrated the attack, and it knows it has been detected, and it knows it has been attributed, and it knows that that information is agreed upon and shared between a host of other countries who are now saying it collectively back at you. So that calling out and shaming of states does, I would contend, have an effect. So does criminalizing the individuals responsible for those attacks, if you can identify who they are, and the US has done that. Again, it can look like a pretty hollow sort of effect when you accept that they're unlikely to be arrested in their home jurisdiction, but they can't travel to another country that has an extradition treaty with, let's say, the US if they've criminalized them. And again, it comes down to shaming. And then we get to, sanctions and diplomatic démarches. And so there is a wide range of stuff that is available, with us not forgetting that SolarWinds is an example of a Russian espionage operation detected by the private sector, attributed by the private sector, called out by the private sector and governments, and leading to Putin being asked directly by Biden questions about what the Russians are going to do about that, and also if we look at Colonial Pipeline and other ransomware attacks, very awkward questions. I suspect about cyber criminality emanating from Russian territory. That's an awkward conversation. That to me feels like the sort of steps you might do rather than trying instinctively to think you're going to hit back in cyberspace. Nevertheless, it has to remain on the table. And therefore, when Putin said, look, if you don't sort out the cyber criminals operating from your territory, then we, the US, might feel we've got to do it. I'm sure offensive cyber operations are part of what Biden means there. So they're on the table. They have to be part of that package of response. They have to be part of being able to retaliate. But they're not necessarily the things you're going to reach for first.
Here's a question from our colleague at IISS, Ben Barry, who's part of our defense and military analysis team based in London. And since we're talking about cyber conflict, Ben goes the whole hog and asks a big question. If there were to be unrestricted cyber war between two great cyber powers, what would be the effects, especially in terms of cyber collateral damage? And I suppose one could add the question to that, is it plausible to imagine an unrestricted cyber war outside of the context of a normal war, if you understand my meaning? Are they likely to be distinct, or are they likely to come together?
So, hello, Ben. I think it's best to think of these together. In other words, when I said earlier that some contend that wars could be won or lost in cyberspace, I don't think they can be won or lost in cyberspace alone. I think that, this idea that there might be red buttons of cyber destruction that can be pressed by presidents, prime ministers and premiers around the world, I think if it ever comes to be, it is a very, very long way off, and I doubt it would ever come to be. I think this is more about thinking of cyber operations in cyberspace as being integrated with and complementing operations in the other domains of warfare if we found ourselves in that situation. And the state that could best cope with that situation would be thinking in the most integrated way. I mean, again, picking a trivial example in what is a large subject, I am thinking about a cyber operation that might disable an air defense capability from in an adversary state to time with what I'm trying to do in the airspace and the land space to win that battle or whatever. I think that leaves a big question around critical national infrastructure and whether states would go all out to destroy the critical national infrastructure of an opponent as a way of trying to press that red button. I think that's much easier said than done. And as I think the question has alluded to, the potential unintended consequences of doing that sort of thing would be have to be well thought through, and whether you could guarantee the result you're seeking to achieve in cyberspace is a very big question. So no, I'm in the camp of thinking of cyber as part of your list of capabilities, with how you integrate those capabilities with your other capabilities being crucial.
Great, 10 minutes to go. I promise we'll wrap up at the top of the hour. So let's see if we can get a few more questions in before Marcus goes. Dominic Nichols. Dominic is the defense and security editor at the Daily Telegraph in London. Dominic asks, how dangerous is the state practice of holding zero-day exploits, and are societies more vulnerable as a result? Now, you may have to talk us through this, Marcus. My understanding is zero-day exploits are weaknesses in code that are known but not cleared up so that you can deliberately exploit them. So, and the implication of this question is that, as opposed to things that hackers get hold of, this is something that states purposefully develop, or at least don't clear up to their own advantage. So how does that fit into the way you view the world, Marcus?
Yeah, so this is a big subject, and you can see steps taken in both the US and the UK over the last few years to talk publicly more about how these sorts of decisions are made and the sorts of considerations that go into them. I think there's a public perception that states are hoarding loads of these sorts of vulnerabilities and thereby potentially jeopardizing the security of the fabric of the internet. That's not true. The default position, particularly, for the states that I've just mentioned, is that you reveal those vulnerabilities. You're always going to take decisions based on the security of cyberspace, the security of your own networks, the security of the networks of your allies. That's going to be the overriding consideration. If in the small number of cases you do hang on to a vulnerability, you will have taken all sorts of risk-based decisions about how that is done in a way that doesn't threaten the wider stability of the internet. I'm not going to say that those decisions as they've been taken in the past have always, well, perhaps the decisions have been sometimes well done, and perhaps sometimes the capabilities haven't been sufficiently well protected. And we can all think of the Eternal Blue leak within the US system. All I'll say is I think there are plenty of lessons learned from that, and it's no coincidence that since those days you will see a lot more discussion publicly by organizations like the National Security Agency in the US about the decisions they are making. Therefore, from the history, it not being known how many of the released vulnerabilities that are patched are discovered by the agencies and released by the agencies without them telling anybody they've done it. So it's a really fascinating subject. I will note, just by way of an aside, I think the Chinese have now made it by law that individuals who discover those sorts of vulnerabilities must reveal them to the Chinese state because they're worried about the security of their own networks. So everybody is worried about how these are handled. And what I'm going to say from the inside is nobody worries about that more than the intelligence agencies in the UK and the US and how those decisions are made in the best interests of everybody.
So a couple of questions on the idea of responsible cyber behavior. So one is from Catherine Yara Nielsen. She says, lots of talk about responsible cyber behavior, but most states are obviously engaging in the same kind of practices. So is it just that some are talking about responsibility and not getting caught? And then he had a separate question from Miriam Howe, a more direct one, saying, she agrees with your points about responsibility, but where should this expectation of responsible behavior come from? Which part of government do you think this position is best stated from? I.e., is it the Foreign Office, the Defense Department? Whose responsibility is developing a responsible cyber policy?
So I think there's a responsibility on all sorts of organs of governments to come up with a national position on what is meant by that particular state's responsible use of cyber. I think then, obviously, when it comes to securing international agreements around it, that's obviously a lead for organisations like the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office within the UK and State Department in the US. In terms of what behaving responsibly in cyberspace really means, I have my own view, of which I think I have four components. One is how you actually conduct a cyber operation. There is an irresponsible way of using global IT vulnerabilities. You've just asked a question about those, or perhaps with worms indiscriminately, without any control, And we can think of examples like WannaCry, like not, you know, which was used indiscriminately by the North Koreans, resulting in the bringing down of the UK National Health Service, like NotPetya, as it was used by the Russians, that resulted in the Maersk shipping line and FedEx and others being hit. Or you can think of operations run with very strict command and control, very targeted and surgical, with lots of mindfulness to unintended consequences. And I can think of a number of examples. So how an operation is run. Secondly, what sort of targets do you go after? Now, I'd be surprised if 16 bits of critical national infrastructure really were put on the table here, because that's a vast subject, with everybody having a different view on what critical national infrastructure really is, and everybody, incidentally, thinking that elements of critical national infrastructure are legitimate targets when it comes to a conflict. So I think that's a really difficult area. I think there's a much smaller subset of targets that everybody could agree ought to be off limits, like emergency services and hospitals, and I would contend nuclear command and control, that perhaps nations could agree you know, nobody would think it was a good idea to go after them. My third category is, hold on, are you hosting cyber criminals in your territory? And what are you doing about it? My fourth category is, are you responsible for the proliferation of your capabilities? Which I think might be an interesting question to the Israeli government around the activities of NSO and Pegasus. So, you know, that's just my starter for four. Other people will have a view, but my point is there needs to be an international conversation about really what we mean by acting responsibly in cyberspace. And I think putting a whole list of targets off limits is not realistic.
Okay, so I'm going to have to apologize to a bunch of people who asked very interesting questions. I'm going to squeeze one in, and you've got about 2 minutes on this one, Marcus. So this is from Bobby Vedral, who works for Macro Eagle Capital in London. And Bobby asks, given your comparative analysis of cyber power, do you think the UK, France, and Germany are complementary, parallel, or uncoordinated in their efforts? So I think Bobby's asking about, to what extent do we see evidence of cooperation? And given the UK and others are part of the Five Eyes network, which you describe in the big report as a big asset to the Western powers, to what extent should the big European powers also be cooperating on cyber? So 2 minutes on that, and then we'll wrap up.
Well, I know from my background that of course they should be, and of course they are. So, you know, from my background, I work very closely with my European partners. Each have different strengths. Each are learning lessons from each other. Each, by the way, and you've mentioned France and Germany, also have, you know, strong relations with, you know, other Five Eyes nations in terms of developing cyber understanding and capabilities, you know, including the US. It is part of the point I think I was making about the ability of what we can call like-minded states, both sides of the Atlantic, Europe in the Far East, you know, Australia, New Zealand, obviously, to come together and share information that can allow for collective attributions and collective operations. So, you know, it's not just policy cooperation here. We are working, the UK and others are working, you know, with these states on actual cyber security and other types of cyber operation. So it's very close, and it shouldn't be a surprise. I would say that a country like the UK is working extremely closely with its European allies, and that countries like the French and the Germans are working closely with allies beyond Europe.
Thank you, Marcus. Okay, so it's now the top of the hour. I promised we'd be finished, so we will wrap up here. Thank you very much for some great questions. As I've said, the IISS has a team working on issues of cyberspace and future conflict. That team will have more reports out soon, including one on great power cyber operations. Marcus himself is beavering away writing the IISS Delphi volume, which will be published at some point later this year, I think, or maybe early next, Marcus, depending on how quickly you move, early next perhaps. So please check in on that. If you want to read more about what we've been talking about, I put the links for Marcus's methodology paper on the website, or you can go and have a look at our website to find the big cyber report, which is free to read. And with that, Marcus, Willett, thank you very much for joining us, and thank you to all of you for joining us and for the many interesting questions. Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning, wherever you happen to be. Thank you very much.